It's nice to get a bit of interaction, yes. So, welcome to What's New in Power Query. This is going to be a bit of a strange presentation because Power Query is not a product on its own. Power Query lives as an experience in lots of different products. But if you learn Power Query in one place, then you can use it everywhere. So, a lot of interesting new things have happened in the world of Power Query over the last year or so. And sometimes because these interesting and new things only appear in some places or they're not part of the main product experience, they get overlooked. And I think there are a lot of really interesting and fun things that have happened in Power Query recently, and that's what we're going to cover in this session. The sponsors and the agenda. It's going to be a very, very demo-heavy experience. We're going to look at what's new in Power Query in Power BI Desktop. We'll look at some new things for Power Query in Excel. We'll look at new things for Power Query and Dataflows Gen 2 in Fabric. We'll have a quick look at some kind of M language and monitoring improvements. And then finally, we'll end with the most exciting thing, I think, that's happened in Power Query for a long time, which is Power Query in paginated reports in Power BI Report Builder. So, let's start with Power Query in Power BI Desktop. The thing I'm going to show you now is not actually released yet, but I've had permission from the team to show it. What they're working on is the new Power Query experience in Power BI Desktop. What do I mean by the new Power Query experience? Up till now, there have actually been two versions of Power Query. There's been the Power Query that you had on the desktop, which is the Power Query experience in Excel and Power BI Desktop. And then there's the version of Power Query which is available in the web-based experiences, for example, in Dataflows. And if you're a Power Query fan, you'll probably know that all of the cool new stuff has happened in that web-based version of Power Query, and it hasn't happened in the desktop version of Power Query. That's because developers being developers, they hate maintaining two code bases. So they put all the new stuff into the web-based version of Power Query, and then they've said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the old desktop-based experience, replace it with this new version in Excel and Power BI Desktop, and that means we'll have one version to maintain, and that means that all the cool stuff that's happened in the web-based version of Power Query will automatically be available in Power BI Desktop. So let's have a look at Power BI Desktop. I have the secret switch turned on that allows me to use this. It's not available yet because it's not quite stable, but hopefully it'll work okay for me. So here's Power BI Desktop. And like I said, I have a preview feature turned on that you will not be able to access. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Get Data, and I'm going to get data from an Excel workbook. It's an Excel workbook that I'm going to be using for all of my demos. It's got some really simple data in. And right from the first, you'll notice that there's a slightly different experience connecting to Excel workbooks. You can see we've got this Browse button here, and I'm going to click Browse, and I'm going to choose my demo data workbook and click Open and click Next. And we can see that there are two worksheets here and two tables. There is a table called Producers, which has some details of farmers who produce various different types of fruit. And then we've got a sales table. So this is the data we're going to be seeing a lot during this session. I'm going to tick both of these boxes, and I'm going to click Transform Data. And this is the new experience. Now, like I said, it's new in desktop. This is all going to be very familiar for anybody who's used the Power Query experience in Dataflows, for example. The first thing that leaps out is we've got the new diagram view up at the top here. And of course, if I go in here and create a new query by merging these two queries, so doing effectively a join, I'm I'm going to do merge queries as new. There's the new merge queries dialog. I'm going to choose producers and sales, select products and product. It's much more colorful, it's much more user-friendly. Click OK, and there we are. We've got that new third box there. Other things to look out for, we've got step folding indicators here that will tell us, will give us an idea of where the query folding is taking place. I can right-click on here and view the query plan. I can see that visual query plan telling me what's going on inside here, which is pretty fun. If I go to the View tab up here, I can switch between Data View, where I see the actual data in this table, and I can switch to Schema View. So I don't see a preview of the data, and this might well be faster if I'm working with large amounts of data or doing lots of complex transformations. One more thing to show. Here in my formula bar, at the moment I can see just the M language for the step of the query that I'm on. But if I go to Script View and go to Query Script, you can see I can switch and see the script for the whole query and edit it here without having to go to the advanced editor, which I think is quite nice. So that's what is going to be new in Power BI Desktop. We're going to close that, and we're going to forget about Power BI Desktop for the rest of the session. Let's talk about Excel. Excel, of course, is where Power Query was born. And, sometimes Excel is seen as the kind of like boring older brother of Power BI. But, interesting things have been happening in Power Query and Excel. So what we'll talk about are Excel data types. Excel data types have been around for a reasonably long time now, but something that did change recently, at least in the last year, is that you can now work with nested data types in Power Query, so we'll see that. One really fun thing that's happened in Excel recently is the integration of Python in Excel. And the interesting thing there is Python and Excel can connect to Power Query queries. That will be fun. And then we can have a look at what's coming with Power Query and Excel Online. I don't have a Mac. I'm a Windows person. Of course I don't have a Mac. So I will say here that Power Query for Mac is the team's priority at the moment. What they've been doing is trying to build out Power Query for Excel on the Mac to make sure it's getting closer to feature parity with Power Query in Windows. That's where they're going to get the largest number of users. So what we've seen recently is Power Query and Excel on the Mac getting access to more and more data sources. So let's go to Excel and see what we can see here. Right, so here's Excel. Right, I think Excel is having a bit of a moment. Okay, all right. Maybe we will close Excel and we'll restart it. There we go. All right, that looks better. So here's Excel. I'm going to go to Get Data, and I'm going to get data from that same Excel workbook that we were using earlier. So let's point it at the right place. And let's get data from demo data. And first of all, let's get data from just the producers table and go into the Power Query editor. And let's build an Excel data type. Has anybody heard of Excel data types? Well, I know you have, Lars, because they're made in Denmark. Excel data types are basically kind of objects that can be stored in a cell in Excel. There are some built-in Excel data types. You can also create Excel data types from Power Query. So let's build a simple Excel data type first of all. Here's my producers table. And what I'm going to do is select all of these columns and then go to Transform. And there's a button here available in Power Query and Excel, which isn't available in any other Power Query because it's not relevant, which is this Create Data Type button. This is going to create a special type of column in my table, which will, when it's loaded to the Excel worksheet, create an Excel data type. So I've selected all of these columns. I'm going to create an Excel data type. I'm going to call it producers. Or actually, no, let's call it products so that we don't get nasty names. You will see that there is a display column, which is going to be the product. I can go to the Advanced tab and do some stuff here with columns, but I'm not going to bother with that. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to go to Home, Close and Apply, Close and Load To, and I'm going to load it to a table on the current worksheet, and click OK. Now, there's my table of data, which is the output. But look, there's something interesting in here. As well as the name of those products, we've got a very interesting looking icon, which indicates that an Excel data type is present. If I hover over this, you can see I've got an indicator showing I can show the card. If I click on that, as well as the name of the product, all of those columns that I compressed together in the data type, those values are displayed here. So you can see for apples, I can see the category, the producer name, the producer address, and producer country. I've also got this extract button up here, and if I click on this, you can see that I can actually say, well, let's create a new column and extract the category. So with my table, I can very easily expand all of those values. I can also click on an empty cell, and I can use Excel formulas to get at the values in here. So if I was to say A2, which contains the Excel data type for apples, and I was going to go to A2.producer country, like that, and hit enter, you can see that I can use a formula to get United Kingdom. As well as that dot notation, I could also go in here and I can use the Excel field value function like this to extract a value and get that out. So that's Excel data types created using Power Query. That's been around for some time now. What is relatively new is if we go back into here and click Edit, I can now have nested data types. So let me delete that step in my Power Query query which created the nested data type, and instead just select the 3 producer columns here. Now, if I transform and create a data type here, I'm going to call my data type producers, like that, and click OK. And you can see in here there is my data type column. But now I can select all of these columns, including the column that contained the data type, create another data type here, and we'll call it products, and click OK. So now I've got a data type which includes columns, one of which is a data type. And if I click OK now, and we take apples again, so if I click compare and click to A2, I can go to A2.producers, and I can extract the Excel data type in producers, and then I can now go to C2.producer country and get United Kingdom out. So there we go. We can have nested data types in Excel using Power Query. So that's data types. Let's look at Python. If I go in here and edit, let's go away and get the sales data from that other sales column. So I'm going to go to Recent Sources, Demo Data, and I'm going to click and connect to the sales table here, and click OK. So there's a Power Query query that connects to the sales table. I am now going to click Close and Load. And by default in Power Query, I've got Power Query set up to not load the output of this query anywhere into Excel. So look, connection only. I'm going to now go onto a blank worksheet. And in cell B2, I'm going to use some Python. Now, Python in Excel is relatively new. It's only available to certain users with certain levels of permission. But I've got access to it. And to use a Python cell in Excel, I can use the py function. So if I type py, use the Python function, and enter, something magic happens. This becomes a Python cell. And this is where I can start typing some Python. I'm not a Python person. I'm going to do a very basic demo, but I do know the interesting thing for Power Query, because here in the Python cell, I can access other data in Excel. I can access data in tables. I can also access data coming from Power Query. And interestingly, I can get data from Power Query queries that have not been loaded onto the worksheet. So this is the Python expression that I'm going to use. And as the pop-up says, if I hit Control Enter, I've got another interesting object sitting here inside my Excel cell. This time, it is a Python data frame. Now, as before, I can click on here and show the card, and I can see the table behind there. I've got something very much like the extract button that we saw up here, and I can actually get a preview of the array or the type name or something. But what I actually want is the contents of the data frame. So at the moment, I've got this cell showing the Python object that this formula returns. But if I click on this drop down here and choose Excel value instead, there is the output of the Power Query query. Now, this is not really very exciting because, of course, I could have just loaded the Power Query query into a cell anyway. But this is a Python script, so I can start to do some interesting things here. Let's say I don't want to just show the result of the output of the query as a table. If I paste in this instead, I can take the output of that Power Query query and visualize it in Python using the Seaborn library. So if I hit Control Enter here, you can't see this very well until I make it a lot larger, but there I've used Python to visualize the data coming from a Power Query query without having to land the data first inside Excel. And I think this is interesting because you could be working with quite large data volumes, and loading the data onto the Excel worksheet and then bringing it into Python could be quite time-consuming. So being able to bypass the worksheet to get hold of your data in Python, I think is really quite cool. One more thing to show, and this is going to lead on nicely onto my next demo. I've got another Excel workbook here, and I've got a very simple Power Query query here. When it wakes up, come on, there we go. Let's edit the query. What this query does is simply get the current date and time in a table with one row and one column.
May I interrupt with the question? Or?
Can I take questions at the end, please?
Of course. Yes.
Cool, thank you. So here on the File menu, I've got this option to export everything in Power Query here to a template file, which I've done before. And here is a .pqt file. So a .pqt file is a way of exporting a Power Query query into a template file, which you can then use elsewhere. We will see where in a moment. But there's my Power Query query, and it's stored in an Excel file in OneDrive. Let's close this. If I now go to OneDrive in the browser, there's the same Excel file that we were looking at. Let's open it. And there is the date and time when I last refreshed this Power Query query. This is Excel Online. Another thing the Power Query team have been doing is building out Power Query in Excel Online. What's available now for everybody is the ability to not only see your Power Query queries in Excel Online in the browser, but if your Power Query queries connect to data sources that do not require authentication, and can, of course, be accessed by a browser-based tool, you can now refresh your Power Query query here. So the reason I wanted this Power Query query to show this demo is that, of course, it shows you the date and time when the Power Query was refreshed. So at this point, it was 10:07 in the morning when I refreshed. If I click the refresh button here, you can see that the time has changed. So we can refresh Power Query queries in the browser. Coming soon, you will again have the full Power Query experience in the browser, and you'll be able to connect to data sources that require authentication. Why is this particularly interesting? Well, it's nice to be able to work with Power Query in the browser, but it doesn't seem to be that exciting. But one of the most highly requested features is the ability to refresh Power Query in Excel unattended, without you having to manually open up Excel and click the refresh button, or to use something like Power Automate Desktop or a script to open up Excel and refresh. I've got a blog post on using Power Automate Desktop to do this, which seems to be incredibly useful. When this is ready, we will also have Office script support for refreshing Power Query queries. So then you'll be able to refresh your Power Query queries in a totally unattended state, for example, from something like Power Automate, without anybody having to go anywhere near desktop Excel, which I think, again, is going to be super useful. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about Dataflows Gen 2. Fabric brings a new version of Dataflows, Dataflows Gen 2. When you first look at Dataflows Gen 2 in Fabric, you will think, nah, it looks like Dataflows Gen 1. There are, however, some important differences. Dataflows Gen 1 were two things. They were a self-service ETL tool plus some storage, which allowed you to kind of take the output of your Power Query queries, save it somewhere, and then make it available to Power BI, for example, as a data source. Dataflows Gen 2 are just a self-service data tool. They do not have that storage associated. How is this an improvement? Well, it's an improvement because now, instead, you have the ability to load data from Dataflows Gen 2 to other sources or destinations, rather, in Fabric or even outside Fabric. So we'll have a look at that. This integration also means that we can move on from what used to be called the enhanced compute engine in Dataflows Gen 1, which was a premium feature. And with Dataflows Gen 2, rather than using some mysterious thing called the enhanced compute engine, Dataflows Gen 2 can make use of lakehouse and warehouse compute inside Fabric to improve the performance of your transformations. And of course, no presentation would be complete without a reference to Copilot, and Dataflows Gen 2 bring Copilot as well. So let's have a look at what's new in Power Query in Dataflows Gen 2. Here is a workspace. It's attached to a Fabric capacity. And I'm going to go to a data flow, Gen 2 data flow, which I've already created, which has nothing in it. We want something in it. Well, I could go away and create a query, but before we do that, very, very quickly, remember template files that I exported from Excel? Well, I can import a template from here. Let's import current time. And there is that Power Query query that I exported from Excel, imported into a Dataflow Gen 2. I've also got the ability to export templates from here as well, which is nice. Now, that's not what I wanted to show here. We're going to get rid of that. And we want to load some data. So let's import some data from Excel again, from that workbook that we showed. I can link to a file here, but I've also got this new option to upload a file. So this is a way of making it easy to import data from Excel for people who are just getting started. I'm going to click and connect to demo data, click open, and what it's doing is it's actually uploading that data to some storage in the background. Upload has been successful. It's only 12K. I kind of hope it would be successful. You can see from the connection that it is some personal SharePoint storage here. Click Next. And let's select those producers and sales tables as we did before and click Create. So here we go. There's our producers and sales tables. This is pretty much what we saw in the new experience in Power BI Desktop a moment ago. But look, we have a Copilot button. Let's press it and see what Copilot can do. This is always exciting because every time I do this demo, it works differently. There are 3 things you can do in Copilot in Power Query. As it says here, it can add new steps to existing queries. So you can ask for a transformation, and it will create a new step in an existing query. It can also create a brand new query from data in existing queries. And finally, it will explain what's happening inside a query. The interesting thing is, even though this worked quite nicely the other week when I did this demo, this morning when I was testing all of my demos, I was not able to create a new step in an existing query. But I'm sure this will work again. So let's take a prompt, which used to create a new step. It might well do again if we're feeling lucky. And what I want is to say, from this table, filter the table so I only have products that were produced in the country France. Let's hit Enter. It's going to work on it. It's going to burn some of my Fabric capacity, but not much, don't worry. It will take a little bit of time. And you can see, as I said, it's decided to create a brand new query, and there's the M for it, and unsurprisingly, I've got just the rows from my products table where the producer country is France. So I can create new transformations. I can also, as I said, get it to explain what this query does. So if I just write the prompt, tell me what this query does, I can hit enter here. And once it's had a look at the M code, it will go in and give me an explanation, which unsurprisingly is select rows from the producers table where producer country column is equal to France. If you're coming in cold as a consultant to somebody else's project and you want to have a look and understand what these Power Query queries are doing, using this option I think is going to be quite useful. It'll give you a very quick, useful overview. Let's get rid of this query, and let's have a look at some of the other options we've got here. So remember I said we have destinations. If I click on the producers table, you can see down here there is a section called Data Destination. It doesn't have a destination yet. And I've also got a button up here, which is for adding a data destination. So I want to load this data to somewhere. I'm going to click Add Data Destination. At the moment, there are 4 data destinations built in. In the future, hopefully, there will be more. I can load this data to a Fabric Lakehouse or warehouse, or I can load it to Azure SQL DB, or indeed Azure Data Explorer, both Azure sources that are completely outside Fabric. Let's choose the Lakehouse option instead. I'm going to click Next. And if I find my workspace here, I'm going to load it to my lakehouse called What's New in PQ. I'll call this Producers Poland. Click Next. You can see that it's going to create a new table for me in this lakehouse. And here, we can see that it's going to load the data into a table with these columns. So it's all very straightforward. And there's something that says Use Automatic Settings. This hides another very interesting set of features. If I turn this off, we can see 2 separate options that we can control. First of all, we can control what happens when we load the data in. At the moment, Dataflows Gen 2 do not support incremental refresh. They will do soon. That's something that's being worked on. But this option is, I think, what actually a lot of people would prefer compared to incremental refresh. Because this just gives you the option to say, when I refresh my data flow, do I want to replace the existing data in the data flow, or actually just append the new data onto the bottom? I can choose using that. I've also got some options here to control what happens when the schema changes, if columns are added or removed. By default here, I've got something called a dynamic schema, which is if the columns change, it will drop the table in the lakehouse and recreate it so that the new columns are added. Old columns that are meant to be deleted will disappear. This could be a little bit dangerous because if you start dropping columns in your lakehouse and you've gone away and built some direct lake models on top of it and built some measures and things, bad things will happen. You'll lose all of your work there. The other alternative is a fixed schema, which means that it will try and work with the changes you've made, but keep the schema in place. So let's save those settings. We've also got some other options on the right-click option here. We've got this Enable Staging option. At the moment, this is turned off, but for sales, which hasn't got a destination, it's turned on. What does this do? Effectively, this is, like I said, the replacement for the enhanced compute engine. In certain circumstances, if you're loading data from a source, and, for example, query folding is not supported on that source, it might be faster to load all of the data into Fabric, stage that data in a warehouse hidden behind the scenes, and then when you do all of your subsequent transformations, those transformations will be folded back to the Fabric warehouse and be much, much faster. That's the theory. In fact, in the real world, loading that data, especially for a lot of use cases, might end up making your Dataflows Gen 2 slower. So if you're wondering why your Dataflows Gen 2 is slow, the first thing to check is whether enabled staging is selected, and maybe try and deselect that and see what impact it has on performance. I'm going to click Publish. One of the things that irritates people most in the world of data flows is what happens when you click Publish, because you've got to wait and wait and wait sometimes. But look, rather than clicking Publish, I'm going to click Publish Later, which is going to allow me to close the data flow without publishing it, so I don't have the waiting around. That's rather cool. If we go back in to Demos Empty, there is my data. I'm actually going to click Publish now. Click Publish. It'll take a little bit of time to publish, but we don't mind about that. Look, there's the little spinny saying it's publishing. And again, another really irritating thing that happens for the data flows developer is you start refreshing a data flow and then you realize you've made a mistake. You say, oh, well, I shouldn't have done that. I want to be able to go back and edit things. I don't want to load the data anymore. In a moment, when the publish finishes and it starts to refresh automatically, what we'll see is that you can now cancel data flow refreshes. All right. So, all right, there is the refresh. You can see it's going. And, all right, this is interesting. That's a little bit of a bug. It can't cancel anymore. OK, but then I can do cancel refresh, and I can cancel that. There's an API for doing this as well, which is pretty good. I have no idea why that data flow suddenly started refreshing. That's a little bit worrying. I'll be sure to report that to the developers. One more thing to show. Let's go to another data flow that I've got here. For certain data sources, there's another option that you can turn on called fast copy. This is something that's pretty new and it's only just been released. So the data sources where this is supported are, for example, Azure SQL or data in a lakehouse or data stored in CSV files. And this is basically a way of saying if you're simply copying data into a lakehouse or doing certain documented, very, very basic transformations like removing columns, then the Power Query engine can actually use a much faster way of loading data into a lakehouse. To use this fast copy option, you've got to go to Options, Scale, and make sure this Allow Use of Fast Copy connectors is enabled. Now, I've got some data here stored in a CSV file in a lakehouse. And you would think, according to the documentation, that fast copy would be supported. I've done something here which ensures that actually, even though I'm connecting to a CSV file in a lakehouse, fast copy is not going to happen. And the good thing is now, in my step folding indicators, I've actually got something that tells me that one or more steps in my query are not supported by fast copy. So that's really useful. This query will use fast copy, at least according to the step folding indicators. No, wait for it to connect. There we go. All right. And there is a step folding indicator that tells me that fast copy is going to work. If I want to force fast copy, I can also use this require fast copy option here. And like I said, for a certain amount of data, if the rules are met, then this is going to make it much faster to load data into a lakehouse. So again, if your Dataflow Gen 2 is slow and you're working with the data sources that support fast copy, experiment with this. Let's exit this. Moving on. This is perhaps the geekiest thing. There are some new connectors, some new functions. We're not going to go into any detail. But one thing I do want to highlight, which I think is quite interesting, is that there is now a connector inside Power Query for Delta tables. Also one that works for Parquet files. So, if you're working with data that's already in Delta format, perhaps you're a big Databricks customer, but you don't want to turn on Fabric, you can still use Power Query to connect to data stored in ADLS Gen 2 storage and stored in Delta format using this new function. Let's have a look at this. If we go to my Delta source Power Query here, I've got a number of demos. I've got some Delta tables stored in ADLS Gen 2 storage here. Again, it's our good old sales data. And this query is using this new function called deltalake.table, which allows me to connect to a Delta file. Delta table, rather. Now, this not only allows me to return the table. If you know anything about the Delta format, Delta stores history. Every time you add some data or delete some data, it doesn't actually physically delete the data. It basically creates a new version. So you've got all of the history of all of the data that's available. And in Power Query, you can actually get hold of that data as well. So if I was to go and have a look at the entire query script here, this value.versions function allows me to connect to a table that gets data from a Delta table, and now I can see all of the different versions of that data. And what's more, I can actually go away and see the data as it was for each version by clicking in this table here. So that's pretty cool. I've also, as I said, got a Parquet.document connector, which allows me to connect directly to Parquet files. And there is also a new Parquet.metadata function, which allows me to get metadata from a Parquet file, which includes all the things like the schema, the columns, and what application created the Parquet file. That's quite fun. Another thing to show, which I think is perhaps the geekiest thing that I'm going to show today, is that we can now get some really interesting information about memory usage inside for data flows, or for the Power Query engine. So I've got a Power BI semantic model here, which connects some data and does some complex transformations in Power Query, which will require lots of memory. A lot of people encounter memory errors when they are doing complex transformations in Power Query, especially if they end up using something like the table.buffer function, or they create calculated columns. What we can do now is actually, when a refresh takes place, have a peek at how much memory was used by the analysis services engine, and also how much memory that was used by the Power Query engine as well. So there are two places where you can get at this. I refreshed the semantic model earlier, and when I refreshed it, I ran a profiler trace. Now, with a profiler trace, I connected to the analysis services engine inside this particular semantic model inside the Fabric Power BI service. And I looked at the command begin and end events, the progress report events, and I can see everything that happened inside the analysis services engine when this refreshed. And for certain events, I actually get information about memory usage. So if you have a look in the text data column for something called mashup peak memory, I go to find previous. What I've got here is a progress report end event, which was generated when a particular partition inside the table was refreshed. And you can see in square brackets down here, information about CPU and memory used by the Power Query engine when this partition refreshed. Here is the command end event for the entire refresh, and I can get an overview of the analysis services peak memory usage, the CPU time used by the mashup engine, and the peak memory used by the mashup engine. So if your refreshes are failing with memory errors, and you want to try and find out what the cause is, well, this is one way of finding out where all your memory is being used. There's something else to show, and this is something that I've only been able to show today because the blog post about it went out yesterday. There is a new profiler event called execution metrics, which has all kinds of other interesting metrics. And here you can see the execution metrics event for that entire refresh, which not only tells me like the number of rows loaded, but the same information, for example, well, they call it M-engine here, CPU time, and the M-engine peak memory usage. So I can now get this information in a separate profiler event. Okay. That is that. I've saved the best thing for last. I know you've been super excited looking at profiler traces and talking about memory consumption and things, but I've saved the most exciting thing for the very end. Power Query has come to somewhere new. It's come to maybe the most boring place possible inside Fabric, paginated reports, but we still love paginated reports. There are times when you have to have paginated reports. You want to be able to export data to PDF or export data to Excel very, very easily. Paginated reports are great for that. But in the past, paginated reports were limited with the data sources they could connect to. They could only connect to the data sources that boring old reporting services could connect to. But that has changed because we now have Power Query built into paginated reports. So paginated reports can connect to any data source that Power Query can connect to, which I think is very cool. Let's have a look at an example. So I'm going to open up Report Builder. I've got the latest version of Report Builder installed here. And I'm going to create a blank report. I'm going to go to the Data tab and look. As well as OneLake, we've got this new Get Data option. This is Power Query. So let's connect. And here we'll be able to see all of the exotic data sources that we can connect to. Come on, wakey, wakey. They're not all shown here, but look, I can now connect to Snowflake. I can now connect to Google BigQuery and Kyligence and HD Insight and whatever Amigo data source is. I don't know. What am I going to connect to? Exactly. But not any old Excel. Let's go back to OneDrive, and let's connect to my demo data Excel workbook here in Excel Online. So look, we've got apples, oranges, pears, and grapes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Webb connector to connect to this particular Excel file. I'm going to copy the URL. I'm going to go to Web API and click Connect. The interesting thing here is I didn't have to authenticate. It didn't remember a previous connection here. It was able to pick up the fact that I created a new shareable cloud connection inside the Power BI service. So this, I think, is a really cool thing. You can basically create shareable cloud connections and then consume them here in paginated reports. Click Next. Connecting to that Excel file through the web connector, which is going to be via OneDrive. And I'm going to click on Sales. And there's my sales table. And we will click Transform Data. There's the full Power Query experience that we know and love. And I'm going to click Create. And what we can see now in my paginated report is that I've got a data source called Power Query, and I've got a paginated report dataset. This is a paginated report dataset, not what a semantic model used to be called. And here, let's call this Sales Report, and I'm going to insert a new table, put that on like that, drag product into here, country into here, sales into here. And to show you that I'm all about pretty reports, let's make the column header bold and click Run. And there is my paginated report getting data from Excel. Now, the interesting thing is when this report ran, it ran the Power Query query. And every time this report runs, it will rerun the Power Query query. And this is the exciting thing. Relatively exciting thing. Because this is not the same as importing the data into Power BI. Because, look, 4 rows, apples, oranges, pears, grapes. Let's go back up to here. Let's go to demo data. Let's add a new row. Let's say we're going to have pineapples from that famous pineapple-producing country, Poland, and the sales of 500. Look, so I've added a new row to Excel. I'm going to close this file again and click Refresh. It's going to run the Power Query query again. Look, there we are. So every time I make changes, those changes are reflected in the report. So I can now do paginated reports live on top of Excel workbooks. And every time somebody makes changes, those changes are going to be reflected live inside the report. I can do things like create paginated reports that connect to web services, that call the web service every time the report renders. I can change parameters and send those parameters back to Power Query, send those back to the paginated report, and get the data back. A whole bunch of things that you can't do in Power BI. Quite often people say, oh, can I do direct query mode in Power BI on top of a web service? No, you can't. But now, because you've got Power Query inside paginated reports, you can have reports that sit live on top of web services, with some caveats about how authentication works. But you get the idea. So, that's it. That's everything that I've had to show you about Power Query and what's new. Hopefully some of these things have been interesting. Hopefully some of these things have been useful. Personally, I think Power Query and paginated reports is going to be very, very useful for a lot of use cases. So, thank you for listening. And if you do have questions, now is the time to ask.
There is one question online.
Okay.
It's quite long, but maybe not strictly related to the core of the session, but is there going to be a way to programmatically check which tables within a given semantic model preserve query folding? Maybe through semantic link, smiley face.
So the question is there a programmatic way to check query folding? No, and I don't believe there ever will be. Because the interesting thing about query folding is that the Power Query engine does not know whether query folding is going to happen until the query runs. Even those step folding indicators are just a guess, because there are some cases where some data sources say, yes, we support query folding, and then actually they return errors when you try to do query folding, and then the Power Query engine will fall back and actually not apply query folding. So it's complicated, but no, I don't think there is ever going to be a way of knowing whether query folding's happening, let alone programmatically. Cool. And you had a question earlier as well. Oh, it was the same question. All right, cool. Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask? Mm-hmm. So the question is, when is the Delta source going to be available? It's already available. It's been available since Christmas. So yes, you can connect Dataflows Gen 2, any Power Query experience. It's available in all of them, including Excel, I think. So you can connect to your data in ADLS Gen 2. If it's in Delta format, you can load it. Any other questions? Yes. So the question is, if I don't specify a destination, can I connect to the data presumably from Power BI Desktop or something like that? So the answer is no. If you don't specify a destination, the data is not loaded. You have to specify a destination if you want the query to actually run and you to be able to consume the data elsewhere. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you very much. I'll see you later. I'm happy to take questions while I'm packing up or anywhere you see me.